She did not run. She could have. There were 3 nights, 3 separate windows of darkness and silence, when the gate sat unlatched, when the dogs were quiet, when the road south ran clear and cold and unguarded. 3 nights when a woman with less endurance might have taken the first open door and disappeared into the desert like smoke. She did not run. Not because she had no will, not because she did not know what was happening to her. She knew exactly. She had watched it done to her mother, to her aunt, to 2 cousins, and a neighbor girl she had once shared a meal with beside a fire in the high country. She had watched it the way a child watches a slow flood, first curious, then understanding, then simply trying to keep her feet. She did not run because she had already decided that running was not the same as free. And that is what most people will never understand about Sira Nakai. They will read what happened to her and call it rescue. They will give credit to the cowboy, and he does deserve some of it. I will not take that from him. And they will say she was saved, and they will feel the warmth of that word, saved, and let it settle in their chest like something finished. But nothing about Sira was finished. Nothing about her was waiting to be completed by someone else's arrival. I know because I was there. I was the one writing it down. I was the one pressing my thumbnail into the brass stack edge of my ledger spine and trying to find the right column for what I was witnessing, and failing, because what I was witnessing did not fit any column I had ever used before. My name is Callum Dre Fenwick. I am 51 years old. I spent 23 of those years as a field assessor for the New Mexico Territorial Bureau of Land and Commerce, which means I have measured approximately 11,000 acres of this earth, cataloged its fences, its creek beds, its rock formations, its contested boundaries. I have stood in the wind on the Cimarron Break, and on the red flats south of Albuquerque, and on the gray clay banks of the Canadian River, and I have written down what I saw with the precision of a man who believes that the truth of a place is best honored by accurate numbers. I have never been more wrong about anything than I was about that. Because the truth of what happened in the summer and fall of 1887, in the Basin country east of the Sangre de Cristo foothills, in a place called Darrow Crossing, the truth of it was not in any measurement I could make. It was in the way she held her chin up even when her hands were shaking. It was in the way she chose, every single morning, to remain exactly herself. This is her story. The cowboy is in it, and he matters, and what he promised her was real. But I need you to understand, before the cowboy arrived, before the promise, before any of it, she was already deciding. The first time I saw the Hallett operation, I cataloged it the way I cataloged everything, systematically in columns without sentiment. North pasture, 260 acres, unirrigated. South pasture, 140, creek access, good grass, slight grade east. Main structure, 1-story adobe, extended twice, irregular footprint. Outbuildings, 3, wells, 2, 1 seasonal. Fencing, 4 miles of post and rail in good repair. Stock, mixed breed cattle, approximately 340 head, some Angus influence. Labor, 6 hands visible. 2 structures near the north fence line that I had categorized as bunkhouse and secondary storage. I made a small notation beside secondary storage. The door had a lock on the outside. That was the kind of detail that lives quietly in a field ledger for weeks before it announces what it means. I wrote it down, exterior lock, secondary north outbuilding, and turned to the next line. I was there for a boundary reassessment, not for anything else. The Hallett Ranch's northeast corner had been incorrectly staked in 1882, and a neighboring water claim had triggered a review. My job was the fence line, not the fence. But I have a habit. I have had it since I was a young man in this work, since my first senior assessor, Barnard Poole, pressed a flat-nailed thumb into my shoulder and said, "Write down what you see, Callum, not what you were sent to see." And the habit is this. I write the extra line. Always one extra line below the official notation in the narrow margin of my working ledger, pressed small so it fits. That line is never part of the filed report, but it is always part of what I know. The exterior lock line sat in my margin for 11 days. Then I went back to measure the water access on the south side, and I saw her. She was carrying water. 2 heavy clay pot containers on a wooden yoke across her shoulders, one on each side, and she was moving from the creek bed toward the main house with the careful, balanced walk of someone who had done this so many times that the weight had become part of her spine. She was young, early 20s, I guessed, though I would later learn she was 24, and her hair was black and cut short and damp at the nape from the heat. She wore a plain work dress, dark blue, worn at the elbows. She did not look up. I noticed that she did not look up, not the way a person looks down at work, intent, absorbed. The way a person has learned not to look up, because looking up involves acknowledging the space around you, and acknowledging the space around you involves experiencing it, and experiencing it is something she had suspended. One of the Hallett hands, a man named Gort, whom I had spoken with twice during the fence assessment, a compact man with a tobacco-yellowed mustache and the manner of someone who confuses indifference for authority, called to her from the fence rail without moving toward her. "Kitchen first," he said, "not the barn." She changed direction without acknowledging him. Not looking up, not responding, simply redirecting her path the way water redirects around a stone. Not in protest, not in compliance, just in the direction of least resistance, because resistance had a cost she had already calculated and decided was not worth it today. I pressed my thumbnail into the spine of my ledger and wrote, June 14, 11:22 a.m. Young woman, water yoke, redirected on spoken instruction without acknowledgement. External lock, north outbuilding, consistent. Ask about secondary structure in land review if opportunity. Then I walked back to my horse and rode the east fence line and measured the remaining disputed corners and wrote them down with precision, and did not think about what I had seen with any particular urgency. Because I had learned in 23 years of this work that urgency is a feeling that outpaces the facts, and facts are the only thing I know how to use. I would come to regret that discipline later. I would look back at those 11 days and the subsequent 14 and understand that I had been doing what the land claim men of this territory often do without realizing it, treating a human situation as though it were a boundary dispute, as though if I measured it correctly and filed it properly, it would resolve itself through procedure. Some things do not resolve through procedure. Her name, I learned later, was Sira Nakai. She was Hikuria Apache on her mother's side and Mexican on her father's. Her father, Tamaz Nakai, had worked cattle in the Cimarron country for 15 years, a competent and careful man, and her mother, who I never learned the name of and who I will always regret not asking for, had died of a winter fever when Sira was 9. Tamaz Nakai had raised Sira and her younger brother on a small sheep and vegetable claim east of Cimarron, and they had done all right, by the understated measures of the territory, not wealthy, not desperate, but present, fed, intact. Tamaz Nakai had died in the spring of 1884 of a broken leg that went bad, as broken legs sometimes did in the remote country when there was no doctor within a day's ride, and the bone had been poorly set. He was gone in 9 days. Sira was 21. What happened after that is the part that I had to piece together later, from records and from Sira herself, and from a man in Cimarron named Odell Pacheco, who had been a friend of Tamaz Nakai, and who sat with me for 2 hours in a mercantile back room, and told me what he knew quietly, with his hands flat on his knees. Sira's father had, in the last months of his life, borrowed against the sheep claim. He had borrowed from a man named Cole Hallett, the patriarch of the Hallett operation I was assessing, a man I had not met at the time of the loan's origin because he was rarely at the ranch itself, conducting most of his business from Santa Fe, where he had a house and a lawyer, and the approximate social standing of someone who had made money just recently enough to still be trying to make people forget how recently. And the loan terms, according to Odell Pacheco, were not clearly written. This is the kind of sentence that means many things. Not clearly written is the charitable version. The less charitable version is that the document Tamaz Nakai signed, which I would later read a copy of, through the Cimarron Records office, at some personal professional inconvenience to myself, did not contain the word loan anywhere in it. What it contained was a term used in certain labor arrangement documents that I had seen twice before in my career, and each time had found difficult to look at directly: service and residence. Tamaz Nakai had signed, in pain and not in full clarity, and almost certainly without understanding the full document, a labor arrangement that transferred his daughter's service and residence to Cole Hallett's operation for the period of 7 years, in exchange for the debt satisfaction. 7 years. Sira was 21 when her father died. She had been at the Hallett Ranch for 3 years when I arrived to measure its fence lines. 4 more years remained on a document her father had signed in dying. I did not know any of this when I saw her carrying the water. I knew only the exterior lock on the north outbuilding and the way she had not looked up. I completed my assessment and filed my report on the northeastern boundary dispute and rode back to my circuit, which that summer covered the land between the Sangre de Cristo foothills and the Pecos River watershed. And I held the Hallett margin notes in the back of my working ledger, and I pressed my thumbnail into the ledger's spine and said nothing to anyone about any of it, because I was a field assessor and not a sheriff's agent, and the labor arrangement, whatever it was a civil matter and not a surveying matter, and I did not know enough yet to act. This is the part I have to live with. The 3 weeks I spent not knowing enough. I came back to Darrow Crossing on the 14th of July for a follow-up measurement on the creek access claim, and this time I arrived at the wrong hour. I had miscalculated the road time from Romero's Crossing, where I had spent the previous 2 nights, and arrived nearly 2 hours earlier than expected, before the ranch was in full operation and before the hands were visible. I tied my horse at the post nearest the south pasture gate and walked the creek bank alone for 20 minutes with my measuring chain and my notebook, and then, coming back around the willow break, found Sira Nakai sitting on a flat-topped rock at the water's edge with her boots off and her feet in the creek. She heard me before she saw me. She stood in one motion, fast, practiced, the way a person stands when they have learned that being found in stillness has consequences, and her boots were in her hands before she had finished turning. "I'm not a Hallett hand," I said. I said it quickly, because something in the speed of her movement told me that the distinction mattered. "I work for the Territorial Bureau. I'm a land assessor. I've been doing the Northeast Boundary Survey." She looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Her eyes were dark and still, and she was assessing me the way I assessed land, systematically looking for the problem before deciding what to trust. "Fenwick," I said. "Callum Fenwick, I have papers if you need to see them." "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was lower than I expected, quiet, and even without the performance of pleasantness that most people apply automatically to a stranger. "I've seen you on the south fence line twice." "I apologize for interrupting. You don't have to move." She did not sit back down, but she did not put her boots on either. She stood with them in her hands at the water's edge and looked at me with the expression of someone recalculating a situation they had not expected. "Are you going to tell Gort you saw me here?" she asked. "No," I said. She looked at me for another long moment. Then she sat back down on the rock and put her feet back in the water. I went back to measuring the creek bank. We did not speak again for 10 minutes. Then she said, without turning, "The boundary you're looking for is about 4 feet west of where the old stake is. The creek shifted in the spring of 1885, and nobody corrected the marker." I stopped measuring. "How do you know that?" "I carry water from this creek 3 times a day," she said. "I know where it was and where it went." I measured. She was right to within 8 inches. I wrote it in my ledger, and I wrote the margin note beneath it. July 14. Sira Nakai. Knows the land, exterior lock on north outbuilding, 3 years. Ask about the document. I found the document 10 days later. It took a ride to Cimarron and a quiet conversation with the records clerk, a methodical man named Lees Parton who had been in that office since before I started my circuit, and who had a particular talent for locating things that had been filed in haste or under confusing headers. "Hallett," I said, and gave him the approximate date range. He found 3 documents. 2 were standard land claim registrations. The third was the labor arrangement. I read it twice, standing at the records counter, and then I asked Parton if I could have a copy made on official assessment letterhead, which was a use of that letterhead that stretched the mandate of my bureau's purpose to its thinnest possible point. Parton looked at me. He had seen things in records offices that most people never see, and he had the expression of someone who had learned to recognize when a document's contents were their own argument for action. "How many copies?" he said. 3, I said. He made them and stamped each one with the office seal, and did not ask me anything further. I put 2 copies in my working ledger, and 1 in the saddlebag's inside pocket, where I kept the things I couldn't afford to lose. Then I rode south toward Darrow Crossing with the specific intention of doing something I was not entirely certain was within my authority, in service of a woman I had spoken to twice, because the exterior lock on the north outbuilding had been sitting in my margin notes for 31 days, and I had finally run out of patience with my own procedural discipline. I should describe the Hallett operation more completely, because the geography of it matters. Cole Hallett himself was not often present. He employed a ranch manager, a man named Voss, 30s, competent and humorless, who ran the cattle operation with the efficiency of someone who understood that his position depended on margins and not on anything else, and Gort, who served as a foreman of the labor side, which included the six hands, the seasonal workers who came and went, and Sira. Sira's position in the operation was not clearly defined to the hands, which is how these arrangements work. She cooked and carried water and kept the main house and mended equipment, and occasionally assisted with the cattle work during the larger seasonal pushes, and none of the hands had been told directly what her situation was. What they had been told, or what they had absorbed by the nature of the lock and the directional instructions and the absence of wages, was that she was not something to be questioned. I had observed over my 3 visits that the hands fell into 2 categories on this subject. Gort and 2 others treated the arrangement as simply the arrangement, the background texture of the operation, as unremarkable as the fence posts. 2 more kept a kind of careful, deliberate distance from Sira, not cruelty, but not intervention either, the studied non-involvement of men who recognize something wrong and have decided that recognition alone is their limit. The 6th hand, a young man named Pelrec, maybe 20 years old, quiet and long-armed and from somewhere east of the Picos, had twice in my observations performed small acts of unnecessary assistance, setting a water container down from a high shelf, placing food within her reach before being asked, that he performed with the specific studied casualness of someone who knows he is being watched and has decided to act anyway quietly without making anything of it. I had noticed Pelrec, I had written him in the margin too, and I had noticed that the north outbuilding, the one with the exterior lock, had its one window on the east face, and that in the evening, when the sun dropped behind the Sangre de Cristo ridgeline and the east wall caught the last lateral light, there was sometimes a faint glow from that window that meant a candle. Someone was reading in there, or writing, or simply keeping a small light going against the dark. I did not know then what I know now about what Sira was doing by candlelight in that room. I know now that she was keeping records. Not for anyone else, for herself. She had, by the time I first arrived at the Darrow Crossing Ranch, filled the backs of 3 flour sacks with small, careful writing. Dates, events, measurements of her own situation, names, what was said, and when, the specific terms of the document as she had read it once over her father's shoulder in the last days of his life. She had never been to school in any formal sense, but her father Tamaz Nakai had taught her to read and write in both Spanish and English with the specific intention of a man who knew that language was one of the few things that could not be taken by a boundary dispute or a bad season. She was keeping a ledger. Not the way I kept a ledger. Not with the professional remove of a land assessor recording creek bed positions. With the specific, unflinching precision of someone recording their own life as evidence, in case they ever needed it, in case someone ever asked, in case the document her father had signed could be contested by the document she was building in opposition to it. She had been doing this for 3 years. She had been preparing her own case for 3 years, alone, by candlelight, in a room with an exterior lock. When I think about Sira Nakai, this is what I think about first, before the cowboy, before the promise, before any of what came later. I think about her writing in the dark, careful and precise, and entirely certain that the truth, recorded correctly, would eventually matter to someone. She turned out to be right, but she had been doing it long before anyone arrived to confirm it. I arrived at the Darrow Crossing Ranch on the 24th of July with my 3 copies of the document, and a story I had prepared about a secondary boundary question that required direct inspection of the North Outbuilding's placement relative to the original 1882 survey stakes. Gort was in the North Pasture. Voss was in Santa Fe with Cole Hallett, who was reportedly there for a land transaction and would be back in 3 days. Pelrec was at the water trough with a gray mare he was cooling down. He saw me ride in and watched me without expression. Then he looked toward the North Outbuilding with a look that was not quite a look, the way a man looks when he wants to direct attention without appearing to direct it. I dismounted. "I need to check a measurement on the north structure," I said to him as though it were routine. "The placement relative to the original survey line." Pelrec looked at the trough. "Lock's on the door," he said. "Gort keeps the key." Is Gort available? He'll be back inside an hour, he paused. The windows open on the east face on account of the heat. He said it without inflection, as a fact, as something I might find professionally relevant. I walked to the east face of the north outbuilding. The window was open. Sira Nakai was standing at it on the interior side, and she had seen me coming. She looked at me through the window with the same systematic assessing expression she had used at the creek. Then she looked at the ledger under my arm. "You found the document," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "How many copies?" "3. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have records of my own, 3 flour sacks, interior east wall, below the window shelf, 3 years of dates and events and names. I have the terms of the document as I read them in my own hand." I stared at her. "I was waiting," she said, "for someone who would know what to do with them." She was 24 years old. She had been waiting, specifically, for 3 years. And she had spent those years making sure that when the right person arrived, she would have something to give them. I pressed my thumbnail into my ledger spine hard enough that I could feel it in the bone. "I know what to do with them," I said. Getting the flour sacks out of the north outbuilding required Pelrec, who did not ask for an explanation, and a window that opened outward, and a 20-minute window of time before Gort returned. I will not record every detail of those 20 minutes here, because some of the specifics involved acts of professional improvisation that the Bureau of Land and Commerce might not endorse, and I have already stretched that ledger thin enough. What I will record is this. When Pelrec passed the 3rd flour sack through the window to me and I took it, it was heavier than I expected, not because of the weight of the fabric, because of the weight of what was in it. 3 years of careful daily entries, written small to save space, cross-referenced to each other with marginal notations. A system she had built herself without instruction, with the pure logic of a person who has understood that their word alone will not be enough, and has therefore decided to make their word so thorough, so specific, so precise, that the absence of corroboration becomes irrelevant. I put all 3 flour sacks in my saddlebag and rode for Cimarron before Gort came back from the north pasture. Sira Nakai remained behind the exterior lock. This is the part I also have to live with, that I left her there. I left her because taking her with me, at that moment, without the legal preparation completed, would have given Cole Hallett grounds to nullify the labor document challenge on procedural grounds and potentially strengthen his claim rather than void it. I left her because the right thing to do and the effective thing to do were, at that moment, separated by exactly the width of legal procedure, and I chose effectiveness over immediacy, and she understood this, and she told me so through the east window before I rode. "Come back," she said. It was not a plea, it was an instruction. 3 days, I said, possibly 4. She nodded, then she said, very quietly and very evenly, so evenly that I almost missed it, "I've been here 3 years. 4 more days is nothing." I rode north with her records in my saddlebag, and the exterior lock still on the door, and the sound of that sentence sitting somewhere in my chest, where I was not able to put a column heading on it. 4 more days is nothing. She said it the way people say the things they have said to themselves every morning for 3 years, until the saying of them has become the architecture of survival. She said it the way you say a thing when you have already chosen to remain yourself, and the remaining has cost you something, but you have decided not to let the cost change the choice. I rode north and I did not look back, because looking back would not have helped her and it would not have helped me, and the most useful thing I could do for Sira Nakai at that moment was to be already in Cimarron with her records and 3 stamped copies of a flawed document, and the specific intent of a 51-year-old field assessor who has spent his career measuring the difference between what was filed and what was true. In Cimarron, I rode directly to Lee's Parton at the records office, and then to a lawyer named Hendrix Cray who practiced from a room above the hardware store, and who had been, as far as I knew, the most consistent territorial civil advocate in the Cimarron circuit for the previous 8 years. A rangy man with a methodical mind and an absolute intolerance for imprecise documentation, which made him, in my estimation, exactly the right person. I laid everything on his table. The 3 document copies, Sira's 3 flour sacks, my own margin notes from 11 visits to the Darrow crossing operation over 6 weeks. Cray read the labor arrangement document twice. Then he read a section of Sierra's flour sack records, slowly, turning the fabric over to follow the writing where it curved around the seam. Then he set it down and looked at me. "She wrote all of this herself," he said. "Yes. 3 years. Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The labor document is fraudulent on 2 grounds. The first is the incapacity provision. Tamaz Nakai was not in sound mind at signing, which her records corroborate with specific dates and symptoms. The second is the term limit. 7 years for a debt of this nature exceeds any defensible limit in territorial civil code. It would have been challenged on those grounds alone in any competent review." "Cole Hallett has a lawyer in Santa Fe," I said. "So do I," said Cray. "And I have better records." He picked up the flour sack again. "This woman documented her own case with more rigor than most civil plaintiffs I have represented. Where is she now?" "Locked in a room on the Hallett property," I said. "Cole Hallett returns to Darrow Crossing in approximately 3 days." Cray looked at me for a moment, the way people look at you when they're deciding whether the situation calls for the long version or the short version. "Then we have 3 days," he said, and pulled out a clean sheet of paper. "I will not recount the full legal procedure here because it is not the story. The story is not the procedure. What matters is this. Within 36 hours, Hendricks Cray had filed an emergency civil challenge to the labor arrangement document with the Cimarron Circuit Court, citing both the incapacity provision and the excessive term clause, supported by Sierra Nakai's own 3-year record and my margin notes from the boundary assessment. The circuit judge, a man named Powell who I had appeared before twice in land disputes, and who had the temperament of someone deeply uninterested in being remembered for the wrong decision, reviewed the challenge the same afternoon. He issued a provisional hold on the labor arrangement, pending full review. That provisional hold meant Cole Hallett could not legally enforce the document's terms. That provisional hold was the piece of paper Hendricks Cray was carrying when he and I and a territorial deputy named Arse rode into Darrow Crossing on the morning of July 28, 1887, 9 hours before Cole Hallett was expected back from Santa Fe. The exterior lock was still on the north outbuilding door. Deputy Arse had a key, or rather he had a warrant, which functions as its own kind of key. The door opened. Sierra Nakai was standing at the east window when it did, because she had heard the horses and she had known, with the specific knowledge of someone who has been preparing for a moment for 3 years, that the sound of multiple horses meant something had changed. She did not cry when the door opened. She did not perform relief. She picked up a small cloth bag from the corner of the room. It contained, as I would later learn, 1 change of clothes, a small folding knife, and a leather-bound book that had been her father's. And she walked out of the north outbuilding into the July morning sun, and she stood there for a moment with her eyes closed and her face up. The sun was very bright. The mountain ridgeline to the west was dark green and still. Then she opened her eyes and looked at me and said, "4 days, you said possibly 4. 4 days, I confirmed." She looked around the property, the pasture, the main house, the outbuildings, the fence line I had spent 6 weeks measuring, with the expression of someone conducting one final assessment. "All right," she said. "What's next?" "That is the question I want you to hold as you continue." "What's next?" "Not thank you, not I don't know what to do, not I'm so frightened." "What's next?" Because she had been answering that question for herself every morning for 3 years, and she was not about to stop. The provisional hold on the labor arrangement gave Sierra Nakai legal protection. It did not give her anywhere to go. This is the part that the procedural mind, my procedural mind, had not fully accounted for. I had been so focused on the document, the challenge, the warrant, the key, the door opening, that I had not adequately prepared for what came after the door opened. Sierra Nakai walked out of the north outbuilding at Darrow Crossing on the morning of July 28th with a small cloth bag, 3 years of records in flour sacks that were now in Hendricks Cray's office in Cimarron, and no home to return to. The sheep and vegetable claim her father had operated outside of Cimarron had been absorbed into a neighboring operation 18 months after Tamaz Nakai's death. The land had been unclaimed, the lease had lapsed, and the new holders had broken the ground for different use. There was nothing to return to. Her mother's Hikaria relations were, in 1887, in a situation that I will not reduce to a simple summary. The Jicarilla Apache in New Mexico Territory were navigating a decade of treaty instability, land pressure, and forced relocation that made a permanent address an uncertain concept. Sierra had not been in regular contact with her maternal relatives since her mother's death when she was 9. She knew names and knew a general direction north of Cimarron, but she was honest with me that she did not know what she would find there, and that arriving as a stranger with needs rather than as a known quantity was a different thing entirely. She had, in practical terms, the clothes she was wearing, the contents of a small cloth bag, and the legal protection of a provisional court hold that did not include room or board. Hendricks Cray had anticipated this, in the way that competent civil lawyers anticipate logistical gaps in a case, and had arranged for Sierra to stay at the residence of a woman in Cimarron named Freda Aldis, who had operated the town's secondary boarding house for 11 years, and who had a reputation for a certain quality of useful discretion. Freda Aldis was 63 years old, widowed twice, and had the demeanor of someone who had absorbed a large amount of the territory's turbulence and converted it into a very efficient management style. She installed Sierra in the back room, a small room, but private, with a real door that locked from the inside, which Sierra spent the first night opening and closing several times, according to Freda, quietly, as though accustomizing herself to the direction of the authority. I know this because Freda told me, not unkindly. She told me a great many things over the following weeks, in the practical way of someone who believes that information shared with the right person at the right time prevents a larger problem. "She's all right," Freda said when I checked in on the 3rd day. "She's quiet, which I like. She's already mended 2 things in the kitchen and reorganized the linen shelf in a way that actually makes sense. She's going to be useful." "She's not here to be useful," I said. Freda looked at me with the patience of someone explaining something to a person who should already understand it. "Everyone is here to be useful, Callum. The question is who decides what they're useful for. Right now, she gets to decide that herself. That's the difference." I pressed my thumbnail into my ledger spine and wrote, "Freda Aldis. The difference, August 1. Cole Hallett returned to Darrow Crossing on the afternoon of July 28th, 9 hours after we had removed Sierra from the North Outbuilding. His response to the provisional hold, relayed to me through Deputy Arce and Hendricks Cray, was approximately what one would expect from a man who had held a labor arrangement for 3 years and had not expected to be challenged on it. He was displeased, and he engaged his Santa Fe lawyer, a man named Corvin who had a significant territorial practice and a particular skill at procedural delay, to contest the challenge. The full hearing was scheduled for late October. Hendricks Cray had Sierra's flour sack records. He also had my margin notes, Pelrec's brief voluntary statement, delivered quietly on a single sheet of paper slid under Cray's office door early one morning with no return address and precise factual content. I had underestimated Pelrec's moral accounting, and I owed him an adjustment, and the incapacity testimony of Odell Pacheco, who had been present in the final days of Tamaz Nakai's life, and who sat in Cray's office for 4 hours, and answered every question with the plain, unflinching recollection of a man who has been carrying a thing for 3 years, and is relieved to put it down in a place where it will do some work. The case was not Cray's concern day to day. The legal machinery was moving. What was left in August of 1887 was the interval. Sierra Nakai in a back room in Cimarron, the provisional hold in place, the hearing in October, and between those 2 points, 8 weeks in which she had legal protection, a borrowed room, and the question she had asked on the morning of July 28th still sitting unanswered. What's next? It was Freda Aldis who told me about Harlan Voss. Not the Voss who managed the Hallett Ranch. A different Voss entirely, no relation. A coincidence of surnames that I noted in my ledger with the professional reflex of a man who spent his career in disputes where a name shared between documents had caused significant problems. This Voss was Harlan Cade Voss, 39 years old, a cattle rancher who worked a mid-size operation in the Red Bluff Basin country, 22 miles southeast of Cimarron. He had been running cattle on a 700-acre spread for 6 years, since buying out the previous holder's claim during a drought year when the price was low and the land's condition was honest. Hard used and not yet recovered, with good bones but needing sustained attention. Freda knew Harlan Voss because he bought supplies in Cimarron twice monthly and sometimes ate at her boarding house table. And because in a territory where information moves through the social infrastructure of small towns, Freda Aldis was the primary infrastructure. "He came by this morning," Freda said to me on the 10th of August. "He'd heard about the situation. He wants to meet the assessor who filed the challenge." "The challenge was filed by Cray," I said. "He asked for the man with the ledger." Freda gave me the look again. "That's you." I met Harlan Voss the following morning at the boarding house table, which is to say I met him at 6:15 in the morning over biscuits and coffee before either of us had decided to be formal. He was a large man, not dramatically, not in the way that announces itself, but in the steady, functional way of someone built for the sustained physical labor of a cattle operation. Broad across the shoulders, large hands, a measured deliberateness in his movements that you see in men who have spent years working alone and have learned that efficiency is the same as patience. He had dark hair gone partly gray at the temples, and a beard he kept closely cropped and brown eyes with a quality I can only describe as unhurried. He did not shake my hand immediately when I sat down. He looked at me first, in the same way Sierra had looked at me at the creek bank, systematically looking for the problem before deciding what to trust. I recognized the look. It was the same look. I noted this privately and found it interesting. Then he put his hand out and we shook. "You're the one who found the document," he said. "I'm the one who found the document," I confirmed. "I've been hearing about this operation for 2 years," he said. "Darrow Crossing. The way the Hallett outfit runs." He poured coffee from the pot on the table, poured mine too, without asking, in the way people do when they're more focused on a conversation than on social protocol. "I should have done something 2 years ago." "You didn't have the document 2 years ago," I said. "No," he said. "I had the feeling that's not the same thing." He looked at his coffee. "What does she need?" I thought about the question. It was, I realized, the right question, not what happened or how bad was it, or what can I do in the vague, expansive way of someone who wants to be helpful without committing to specificity. He had asked what she needed, which meant he was already thinking in terms of concrete provision rather than abstract concern. "Stability," I said. "The hearing is in October. Until then she has Freda's back room and a legal hold, but no permanent arrangement. After October, if the case goes as Cray expects, she has the end of the labor documents enforceability, but still no land, no claim, no income, no family presence nearby." Harlan nodded. He was listening the way people listen when they're not waiting for their turn to speak. "I have a ranch that needs a second person," he said. "Red Bluff Basin, the winter work especially. I've been running the operation alone for 3 years, and it's manageable but not well. I'm not suggesting anything other than honest work at honest pay, with a separate quarters building that's been standing empty since I bought the place. No arrangements beyond a fair employment agreement, and the understanding that she stays, or she goes entirely at her own decision." He said it plainly, without decoration. He was not performing generosity, and he was not minimizing what he was offering. He was stating a practical situation with the same directness he would use to describe the condition of a pasture. "That's for her to hear," I said. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you first because I wanted you to know what I'm going to say before I say it to her, so you can decide whether to bring me to meet her." He looked at me directly. "I don't want to be another person who arrives at a decision about her situation before she does." I pressed my thumbnail into my ledger's spine. I wrote later that evening, August 11, Harlan Cade Voss. "I don't want to be another person who arrives at a decision about her situation before she does. Bring him to meet her." I brought him to meet her on the 13th of August. Freda Aldis provided the table and the coffee, and then removed herself to the kitchen with the precise tact of someone who knows when a room works better without her in it. Sierra Nakai sat across from Harlan Voss for the first 40 seconds without speaking. She was doing the systematic assessment again. He sat under it without fidgeting, without performing patience, without doing anything except being present, which I noted as a form of competence specific to people who have spent enough time alone to become comfortable in their own stillness. Then she said, "What does the separate quarters look like?" "Not tell me about yourself. Not why are you doing this. What does the separate quarters look like?" Because she had been living in a locked room and the door that locked from the inside was not abstract to her. Harlan Voss described it. The southeast structure, one room, adobe construction, a stone hearth, a window on the east and the south. He described it specifically, including the damage to the south window frame from a hard winter 2 years prior and the repair he had done, and the gaps he had not yet fully addressed. He did not oversell it. He described it with the accuracy of someone who knows that honesty about a building's flaws is the foundation of a trustworthy description. Sierra listened. Then she said, "The south window frame, what kind of repair did you do?" He told her. She asked 2 more questions about the construction materials and the hearth efficiency. He answered both without asking her why she was asking. After the 4th question, Sierra looked at him with an expression I had not seen on her before. Not the systematic assessing look, not the suspended experience look from the first day at the creek, but something that was beginning to be present in the way the window questions had been present. Direct, engaged, forward-looking. "I'll need to see it before I decide," she said. "Of course," he said. "And the employment agreement needs to be in writing," she said. "Clear terms, my signature and yours with a copy held by a third party." She glanced at me. "Fenwick." "I can hold the copy," I said. She nodded, then she looked back at Harlan Voss and said, "You said honest work at honest pay. What does the pay look like?" It was not a question. It was the beginning of a negotiation, conducted by a woman who had been negotiated over for 3 years by people who had never asked her to be present for the discussion, and who had therefore decided that she was going to be the one present for this one. Harlan Voss named a figure. It was, in my estimation, fair. Sierra looked at the table for a moment, then looked up. "One more," she said. "All right," he said. $40, she said, "monthly plus the quarters. I'll work the same hours as any other ranch hand, same responsibilities, and I'll take direction on the cattle work but not on anything else. And the agreement runs month to month, not annually, so either of us can end it with 2 weeks' notice." Harlan Voss was quiet for a moment, not the hesitation of someone reconsidering, the pause of someone doing the honest arithmetic. "38, he said, "which is what I can carry until the spring sale. After that, 40 if the quarter holds." Sierra looked at him. 38 now. 40 confirmed in writing as the rate upon spring sale, binding regardless of the sale outcome. "A beat." "Yes," he said. She put her hand across the table. He shook it. Freda Aldis, from the kitchen doorway where she had been not listening, made a sound of quiet approval and went back to her cooking. I drove Sierra Nakai to Red Bluff Basin on the 16th of August in a borrowed wagon, with the employment agreement in my ledger and 2 copies in my saddlebag, and a third with Lee's Parton in Cimarron for good measure, because I had learned from Sierra that documentation in triplicate is not excessive. It is simply adequate. The 22 miles were quiet for the most part. Sierra sat on the wagon bench and watched the country go by with the expression of someone relearning what it feels like to observe the landscape without the specific background awareness of confinement. About 10 miles out, she said, "Tell me what the ranch looks like from the road." I told her what I knew. The Red Bluff Basin was a broad, shallow valley between 2 low ridge lines, the Red Rock Formation on the northeast that gave it the name, the creek that ran the west boundary, the grass that was recovering well after the drought years. Good pasture, room to expand if the adjacent claim ever came available. "He's been running it alone," I said, 6 years. "I know," she said. "He told me." She paused. "Why alone?" "I don't know," I said. "I didn't ask." "I'll ask him," she said. She did, I learned later, ask him. And Harlan Voss told her, which was already more than he had told most people, that he had come to the Red Bluff Basin from a previous life in Kansas that he did not fully account for, with enough money to buy the claim and enough resolve to make it work, and that he had found, in the years since, that solitude was something he had never decided on. It had simply accumulated, the way dust accumulates on a surface you don't disturb. "And the accumulation didn't bother you?" Sierra had asked. "It bothered me," he said. "I got used to it, which is different." This is the account she gave me of that conversation, several weeks later. She gave it to me in the same tone she used for all accounts, specific, measured, without unnecessary embellishment. She had been practicing accurate account-keeping for 3 years, and it had become the way she processed experience. Precisely, with attention to the distinction between what happened and what she felt about what happened, both recorded, neither suppressed. She was 24 years old, and she had the narrative discipline of someone twice her age. Built under circumstances I find difficult to think about for too long without wanting to revise history, which is the one thing my training makes absolutely clear is not possible. The south window frame at the southeast quarters building was, in fact, in need of further repair. The east window was good, the hearth worked. The room was small but functional, and it had a door that locked from the inside, and Sira Nakai stood in the middle of it for a long moment on the afternoon of August 16th with her cloth bag in her hands, and her eyes going around the room in a way I recognized as inventory. Then she put the bag down and opened the east window, and stood at it for a moment with the afternoon air coming in. "The south frame," she said. "I can do the repair myself if you'll get me the materials." This was directed at Harlan Voss, who was standing in the doorway with his arms at his sides, and the specific careful quality of a man who has offered something, and is now restraining the impulse to explain or elaborate because the offering has been accepted, and further words would only complicate it. "I'll get you the materials," he said. I left them both there, Sira at the east window taking inventory of the horizon, Harlan in the doorway with his hands at his sides, and walked back to the wagon and sat with my ledger and thought about what to write. I wrote August 16, Red Bluff Basin. She is here. The window opens from the inside. She opened it herself. The south frame will be repaired. Then I wrote the extra line, the margin line. This is not the end of the story. The hearing is in October. Hallett's lawyer will not make it simple. But the room is hers and the door locks from the inside, and she already knows how to use the distance between where she is and where she needs to get to. She's been calculating that distance for 3 years. She'll be fine. I put the ledger away and drove back toward Cimarron, and held the particular uncomfortable weight of being a 51-year-old man who has spent his career measuring land, and has now measured something he doesn't have a column for, and knows he is going to carry it for a long time. August and September at Red Bluff Basin happened without me for the most part. I had other assessments, other disputed lines, other exterior locks in other margin notes that I had not yet done anything about. I rode the circuit and did the work and sent 2 letters, one to Hendrix Cray about the October hearing, one to Fretta Aldous, who had a talent for useful information even at a distance, and received 2 in return. Cray's letter was efficient and positive. The flour sack records were, in his professional estimation, the strongest element of the case, and Odell Pacheco's testimony was solid. Corvin, Hallett's Santa Fe lawyer, had filed a counter-challenge on procedural grounds that Cray dismissed in the same letter as competent obstruction that will not survive the hearing. Fretta's letter was less efficient and more useful. She had spoken with Harlan Voss's supply contact in Cimarron, a feed merchant named Aldana who saw Voss twice monthly and had a long memory, and had assembled the following. Harlan Voss had come to the territory from Hays, Kansas in 1881 under circumstances that Aldana described as a difficult departure, not a scandal, more like a man who needed a new set of walls around him. He had a brother in Hays who he wrote to annually. He had been engaged once before Kansas to a woman named Margit who had died of a fever in the winter of 1879, and he did not speak of her, but he kept a small daguerreotype in his shirt pocket that Aldana had seen him take out twice in 6 years, always alone, always on quiet mornings. I read Fretta's letter twice. Then I wrote one line in the margin. He is also building something for one. He has been doing it longer than Sira. I sent no response to that observation. It was not the kind of thing I could act on. It was the kind of thing that was either true and would resolve itself in its own time, or true and would not, and there was no measurement I could make to determine which. I came back to Red Bluff Basin on the 12th of September for 2 reasons. The first was that I had a legitimate assessment to conduct on the adjacent parcel to the north, which abutted Harlan Voss's claim on the northeast corner and required his confirmation of the shared fence line. The second was that I wanted to see how the south window frame had been repaired. The south frame was, in fact, repaired. Sira had done the work herself with materials Harlan had procured from a Cimarron lumber supply, using a method she described as the most efficient one for the material thickness that she had worked out through observation and practical trial. The repair was tight and clean and more thorough than the one Harlan had done previously. I measured the northeast fence line with Harlan Voss, who walked it with the efficiency of someone who knows his own land well and does not need to perform the knowing. We were done in an hour and a half. Sitting afterward at the table in the main house, where Sira had made coffee in the way she made everything, with a specific and unpretentious competence, I watched the two of them navigate the small geography of a shared workspace, and I noted, in the particular way that a man with a ledger notes things, that they had developed a set of operational habits in 3 weeks that took most partnerships significantly longer. They moved around each other without collision, not because they were careful of each other's space, but because they had each developed an accurate sense of where the other one was. Harlan handed her the tin for the coffee shelf without being asked and set it at the right height. Sira set his cup on the left side of the table without asking, which was where he reached, and did not set mine there, which was where she'd put mine the previous time. Small things. The kind of small things that are either data or they're not, and I had enough years in this work to know that they were data. I did not write about them in the official ledger. I wrote them in the margin. September 12, Red Bluff Basin. They have learned the geography of the same space in 3 weeks. The window is repaired. The coffee cup goes on the left. What I want to tell you about before we arrive at October is a conversation I had with Sira on the morning of September 13th, before I rode out for the next circuit stop. She was at the south window, the repaired one, watching the sunrise over the red rock formation, with a cup of coffee and the expression of someone engaged in a thought she was not yet finished with. I was loading my saddlebags at the hitching post near the main structure, and I said, because I was curious and because I had been waiting to ask, "How are you?" It is a question that requires no particular courage. But I had been not asking it, because I was aware that the honest version of it, coming from a 51-year-old field assessor who had spent 6 weeks in the machinery of her situation, might feel like an examination. I had been waiting until she was the one with the question, and I was simply the person standing near enough to answer it. She turned from the window and looked at me. "I'm figuring out what I want," she said. "I've spent 3 years figuring out how to endure. That's different." I sat on my saddlebag and looked at her. "What does it feel like?" I asked. "The different." She thought about it. She had the habit, I had noticed it across multiple conversations, of pausing before answering anything that required precision, not because she was uncertain, but because she was accurate, and accuracy sometimes requires a moment. "It feels like more space," she said. "Like the room is bigger, not because anything changed, because I stopped spending the space calculating how to stay in it." She looked back at the sunrise. "Also," she said, "I am angry. I want you to know that. I'm not only figuring out what I want, I'm also very angry." "I know," I said. "I want it in the record," she said. "It's in the record," I said. I wrote it that evening, September 13. She is figuring out what she wants. She is also very angry. Both are in the record. Both are correct. The October hearing date arrived, and I will tell you now what happened in it, but not yet. Because between September and October, one more thing happened that belongs in Part 2. It happened on the 23rd of September, after a heavy early rain that had washed out the South Pasture access road, and kept both Harlan and Sira inside the main structure for most of a day with the particular cabin fever quality of shared confinement, in a space not designed for extended conversation. By midday they had talked through everything immediate, the cattle, the fence repair backlog, the winter supply order, and had arrived at the quieter country of personal history. I know this because Sira told me. She told me in the same precise way she told everything, not as narrative drama, but as factual account. She had told Harlan about her father, about the sheep claim east of Cimarron and the way Tamaz Nakai had taught her to read and write in 2 languages because he understood what language was for. About her mother, whose name was Yara, who had made beadwork in patterns that were partly Hikaria and partly her own invention, and who had died when Sira was 9, and whose face Sira could still see clearly if she let herself. And Harlan had told Sira about Margit. He had taken the daguerreotype from his shirt pocket and put it on the table between them. "Her name was Margit," he said. "She died in the winter of 1879. I've been carrying the photograph for 8 years because I haven't known where else to put it." Sira had looked at the daguerreotype for a moment. Then she had said, carefully, "She looks like someone who laughed at surprising things." Harlan had been quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "she did. That's exactly what she did." He picked the daguerreotype up and put it back in his shirt pocket. And then, after a moment, he said, "Sira reported this to me with the same precision with which she reported everything. And I believed every word of it because it is the kind of thing that is either exactly right or entirely wrong. And it was exactly right," he said. "I've been trying to build something that would feel like enough." "Has it?" Sira asked. "Not yet," he said, "but it's beginning to." She did not tell me what she said next. That part was not for me. I respected this completely. I wrote in my margin, September 23. He told her about Margit. She told him about Yara. Some records are not for the official ledger. They're for the people who made them. The basin's been building since 1881. It is beginning to. The hearing was on October 19th, 1887. I rode to Cimarron 2 days early. Not because the hearing required my presence. Technically, my margin notes were already in evidence, submitted through Cray, and I had provided a written statement as well, but because I had been present at every stage of this thing, and I did not want to be absent at the end of it. Sira and Harlan rode in together on the morning of October 18th. Harlan had offered to drive the wagon. Sira had said she would rather ride, and he had sourced a good bay mare from a neighbor without comment, and they had made the 22 miles on horseback, arriving at Freda Aldis's boarding house in the early afternoon with the look of people who had ridden a distance in reasonable weather and were not dramatizing the arrival. Freda looked at them when they came in, and Freda looked at me, and in the particular compressed language of Freda Aldis's expressions, she communicated, "Yes, I see what you see, and no, we are not going to discuss it yet." Hendrix Cray ran a preparation session that evening at his office above the hardware store. He walked Sira through the sequence of events, the document, the flour sack records, what Corvin would likely argue, and what she needed to remember to say, and what she needed to leave to him. Sira listened and asked 3 precise questions, and added 1 correction to Cray's timeline, which he accepted and notated without defensiveness, because it was correct. "You've been preparing for this for 3 years?" he said at the end. "Yes," she said. "Then you are significantly better prepared than most witnesses in a case like this," he said. "Let me do the procedural work, and you do the factual work, and we'll be fine." Sira looked at him. "Corvin is going to try to make the incapacity argument about my father seem like a convenient claim, rather than a documented one." "He is," Cray said. "The flour sack records have 14 entries from the 6 weeks before my father died," she said. "Dated, specific, each one noting his condition, what he said, what he could and couldn't understand. The last entry is 2 days before he signed the document." Cray looked at her over his reading glasses for a long moment. "I know," he said. "That's why I said we'll be fine." The October 19th hearing was held in the Cimarron Circuit Court, a room I had been in 5 times previously for land disputes, a spare practical space with pine benches and high windows that let in a flat northern light. Judge Powell presided with the specific, contained authority of a man who has heard a great many cases, and has therefore heard most of the arguments that lawyers believe are novel. Corvin was competent. I will give him that. He argued the document's validity with the specific professional skill of someone who has constructed a version of events that is internally consistent if you accept its premise, which is the premise that Tamaz Nakai had been sufficiently coherent at signing, and that the term's length was standard for the territory, and that the current challenge was motivated by sentiment rather than legal substance. He was competent and he was wrong, and the wrongness was not a matter of interpretation. It was a matter of record. Sira's flour sack records were submitted as evidence. Cray walked through them entry by entry for the relevant 6-week period, reading specific dates and conditions, and the room was very quiet. Odell Pacheco testified for 40 minutes. He was not eloquent. He was precise and consistent, and he said what he had seen without embellishment, and the consistency of his account with Sira's records, the same dates, the same observed symptoms, the same witnessed confusion in Tamaz Nakai's speech and comprehension, was not a prepared performance. It was 2 people who had each independently been paying attention to the same situation and had each recorded it honestly. Corvin's cross-examination of Odell Pacheco produced nothing useful for his case, because there is nothing useful to extract from an honest man who is simply telling you what he saw. Sira testified for 25 minutes. She was direct, composed, and specific, and she made no claims she could not support with dated documentation, and she corrected herself once. a date she had initially said as August, and then corrected to late July, in the immediate spontaneous way of someone whose accuracy is not performed but reflexive. I watched Corvin watch her, and I watched him recalibrate, in the specific visible way of a lawyer who has built a case on the premise that the opposing witness will be uncertain or emotional or vulnerable to pressure, and has encountered instead a 24-year-old woman with 3 flour sacks of evidence, and the forensic patience of someone who has been preparing this testimony by candlelight for 3 years. He knew, by the end of her testimony, that he was not going to win on the document's validity. What he tried for in the final phase was a damages limitation, an argument that even if the document were voided, the Hallett operation had provided room and board for 3 years, and that this offset any compensatory claim. Judge Powell asked 2 questions about the room and board conditions. Corvin answered them. There was a pause. Then Powell said, in the dry, measured voice of a man who has been doing this long enough to say the thing clearly, "Mr. Corvin, I am looking at an exterior lock that operated from the outside of a residential space in which a young woman lived for 3 years under a document you have not successfully defended. I am not going to spend additional time on the offset argument." He ruled the labor arrangement void. He ruled the original debt satisfied by the 3-year service period, which he noted had exceeded any defensible standard for the amount borrowed. He ruled for the recovery of wages owed at a standard labor rate for the 3-year period, to be calculated by the court clerk and enforced against the Hallett estate, minus the value of the room and board which Powell, with a particular careful neutrality, assessed at the lowest defensible rate on record. Cole Hallett was not present. Corvin received the ruling on his behalf with the professional composure of a lawyer who had known for the past 4 hours that this was how it was going to go. Hendricks Cray shook Sierra's hand. Then he said, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has done a thing well and knows it, "You prepared this case, I presented it, but the preparation was yours." Sierra looked at him, then she looked at me. "I had helped getting the documentation into the right hands," she said. "That mattered." She said it directly, without performance, the way she said everything, accurately and without embellishment, and with the specific care of someone who does not want to give credit incorrectly and does not want to withhold it either. "It was your hands that made the documentation," I said. "I just opened a window." She looked at me for a moment with the expression that was neither the systematic assessment, nor the suspended experience, nor the forward-looking presence. The expression I did not have a column for, the one I had been carrying in my margin since July. "You opened the window and you came back," she said. "That's not nothing." I pressed my thumbnail into my ledger spine until the groove ached. "No," I said, "I suppose it isn't." After the hearing, Freda Aldis hosted a dinner at the boarding house table that included Cray, Odell Pacheco, Lee's partner from the records office, Pel Rec, who had ridden from Darrow Crossing on his own time, arriving that morning with the quiet propriety of someone who understood he was an auxiliary character in this story, but had decided to be present for the conclusion, and Harlan Voss, who sat at the far end of the table and was not effusive and not silent, and passed food without being asked, and refilled coffee with the easy competence of someone accustomed to a shared table. Sierra sat between Odell Pacheco, who she thanked in terms that made him look at the ceiling, and Pel Rec, who she thanked by telling him, quietly and specifically, that she had known it was him who slid the testimony under Cray's door, and that the facts he had included about the dates and conditions of her confinement had been exactly the corroboration that mattered, and that she wanted him to know that. Pel Rec looked at his plate for a moment, then he said, "I should have done it sooner." "Yes," Sierra said, "but you did it." There was, in that exchange, something I could not have put in an official column if I had tried. I put it in the margin and left it there. After dinner, when the table had cleared, and Freda was doing the necessary work of a boarding house proprietress, and Cray had taken Pacheco back to his hotel, and Parton had gone home with the particular satisfaction of a records clerk who has seen good use made of well-kept documentation, I sat on the front step of the boarding house with my ledger and my coffee and the October air, which was cold now, properly cold, with the specific mineral edge of the high country in autumn. Harlan Voss sat beside me without asking, in the way that people do when they've decided the conversation they need to have is ready, and the location is incidental. We sat without speaking for a few minutes, Down the street somewhere, a horse shifted in a hitching rail. The moon was coming up behind the ridge. "She's going to be all right," he said, not as a question, not as a comfort offered to me. As an observation stated carefully by a man who has been making observations for a long time. "Yes," I said. "So is the ranch," he said. Then, after a pause, "I told her something about 3 weeks ago." "I know," I said. He looked at me. "She told you." "The part she told me," I said. "She kept the rest." He nodded. He looked back at the ridge and the moon. "I've been making the thing for one," he said. "That's all I was trying to say. I've been building the ranch for one person, and I think I built some of the windows wrong." I thought about Bram Setter's repair ledger, which was a story I had heard from a land assessor colleague once and had never forgotten. I thought about the way some structures are built for their current occupant, and then need to be understood from the outside before the inside can change. "Windows are repairable," I said. "I know," he said. "She already fixed one." We sat with that for a while. Then I said, "She is also angry, still. You should know that and not try to do anything about it." He looked at me with the unhurried brown eyes. "I know she is," he said. "It's appropriate I'd be angry." "Yes," I said, "but knowing it's appropriate and knowing what to do with it when it arrives in a room are different things." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you do?" I thought about it. "You don't do anything," I said. "You stay in the room, you don't explain it or name it or try to resolve it. You just make sure the room is large enough that the anger has space to be there alongside everything else. It'll find its own level." He looked at the street. "That's not how I'd naturally put it." "How would you put it?" He thought for a moment. "Like water in a basin," he said. "You don't pour it in a different direction, you just make sure the basin is large enough." "Yes," I said, "that." He stood and nodded once, not goodbye, more like the confirmation of a decision made, and walked back inside. They rode back to Red Bluff Basin together the following morning, Sierra on the bay mare and Harlan on his own horse, and I watched them go from the boarding house steps with my ledger under my arm and Freda Aldous beside me. "Well," Freda said. "Well," I said. "You're going to ride yourself back to the circuit now and pretend you're not thinking about this," she said. "I'm a field assessor," I said. "I have 3 disputed boundaries waiting for me north of Rayado." "Is that a yes?" she said. "It's a description of my professional obligations," I said. She made the sound she made when I was being deliberately dense, which is a sound I have known for many years and have come to respect as a form of accurate editorial. I rode north to Rayado and the disputed boundaries, which took 2 weeks and involved a surveying disagreement that dated to 1872, and a water access claim that had been incorrectly recorded under 2 different parcel numbers, and which I resolved by finding the original 1869 survey markers still buried under a rock formation that had been assumed to be natural, but was in fact the surveyor's boundary stack, which I unearthed with the specific satisfaction of a man who knows that the truth of a thing is most often exactly where the original person put it, if you're willing to go back far enough. I sent a short letter to Sierra at Red Bluff Basin from Rayado. I told her about the 1869 markers. I am not entirely sure why, except that it seemed like the kind of thing she would find interesting, and I had become, over the preceding months, accustomed to sharing the kind of things she would find interesting with her, in the same way you become accustomed to a reliable correspondent. Her reply came 3 weeks later, in the small, precise handwriting I had come to recognize from the flour sack records. Clear, close-spaced, nothing wasted. She had started keeping the ranch's accounts. She had noted an error in the winter supply estimate that would have shorted the feed by approximately 40 days, which she had caught and corrected. She had also, she mentioned, started writing again. Not the evidence records, not the daily documentation of the previous 3 years, but something different, something she did not name yet, something she was working out as she went. The south window was holding well. The east window needed a new piece of glazing that would come with the next simmer and supply run. The angry was still there, she said. She used it for things. Harlan Voss, she said, had started building a second room onto the main structure, not for any stated reason, just because there was material and time, and the plan had always been to have more space than one person required. She did not say anything further about this. She did not need to. She trusted the reader to infer the emotional meaning, which is the mark of someone who has spent 3 years learning the difference between evidence and explanation. I put the letter in my ledger between 2 pages of the Red Bluff Basin assessment and rode the circuit. I came back to Red Bluff Basin on the 4th of February, 1888. I had a legitimate reason, a water right clarification on the eastern boundary. And I also had the kind of wanting to see how something went that I did not admit to in official correspondence, but which had been sitting in my chest since October. The ranch was changed in the specific, incremental way that things change when sustained attention is paid to them. The south pasture access road had been regraded. The fence on the northeast corner had been restaked with the correct markers. The main structure had, in fact, a second room in construction off the east wall, framed in timber and plastered to the weather side. Harlan was at the east fence when I arrived. He raised a hand in the way of someone who has expected a visit and is not surprised by the timing. Sierra was in the southeast quarters, her quarters, the repaired window, the east light. And when I knocked, she said, "Come in," without asking who it was, which is the particular quality of someone who has recalibrated the relationship between a door and a threat. She was writing, not the flour sack records, a different notebook, ordinary brown-covered, the kind sold at the General Mercantile for school use, open on the small table at the east window. She had covered perhaps a third of the pages. "What is it?" I asked. I had earned the question, I felt. She looked at it for a moment. "An account," she said, "of what happened from the start, my father, the document, the 3 years," she paused, "and what came after, the Creek Bank, you cray, the hearing here." "For the record," I said. "For anyone who needs to know," she said. "In case it's useful." She said it the way she said everything, accurately, without embellishment, with the forward-looking quality of someone who has moved from endurance to intention and is finding the territory between them interesting. "Will you let me read it?" I asked, "when it's done?" "You're already in it," she said. "You can read it." I sat in the spare chair. There was one now, a second chair, which had not been there in August. And I looked at the east window and the February light and the red rock formation visible in the distance against the pale winter sky. "How is the ranch?" I asked. "Better than October," she said. "Better than December. It'll be good by spring." She picked up the pen again. "We're talking about the adjacent parcel to the north." "The claim I assessed in September," I said. "It might come available," she said. "If it does," she looked at the window, "if it does, there's a possibility." I did not ask what the possibility was. Some futures are better left in the notation stage. What I knew was that she was already looking at the horizon in the forward-looking way, not the endurance way, and that the difference between those two looks is the measure of what had changed since July. The angry was still there. I could see it in the precision of her speech, in the specific care she took with words, in the fact that she was writing the account at all rather than simply leaving the experience in the past as an inconvenience resolved. The anger was not in the way she had held herself through 3 years of a locked room. The anger was focused now, purposeful, a tool she was learning to use the way she had learned to use the south window repair, with the most efficient method for the material. This is what I want to tell you about Sierra Nakai in the end. Not that a cowboy gave her a home. He offered one, and the offer was honest and real, and she examined it with the systematic care she examined everything and decided on her own terms that it was something she was willing to build into. Not that the case won and justice was served and everything resolved. The case won. The wages came, eventually, in a reduced but real amount, after Hallett's lawyer filed 2 more procedural challenges that Cray dismissed with the specific patient efficiency of someone who has a better case. Justice is a more complicated word, and I have been in this work long enough not to use it carelessly. What I want to tell you is this. Sierra Nakai spent 3 years preparing for a moment that she did not know was coming, by a person she did not know existed, using skills her father had given her because he understood what language was for. And she did this in a locked room by candlelight with no guarantee that the moment would ever arrive. She did this because she had decided that the truth, recorded correctly, would eventually matter to someone, and that the preparation for being heard was the work she could do inside the room while she waited for the door to open. She was right. She was right, and when the door opened, she asked, "What's next?" Not because she had forgotten what had been done to her. not because the anger had been resolved or the loss converted to something less. Because she had made a decision, at some point in those 3 years, that she never specified to me, but that I believe she made before the first night in the locked room, that she was not going to let the 3 years be what she was made of. She was going to be made of the writing, the flour sacks, the Creek Bank knowledge and the south window repair, and the negotiated employment agreement, and the account she was writing by East Window Light in February. She was going to be made of what she chose, and what she chose was this: to know herself completely, to record herself accurately, and to move forward with the specific and unhurried certainty of someone who has been waiting a long time and is now done waiting. I rode back to the circuit on the 6th of February. At the eastern boundary, I found the water right marker I had come to assess, which was, as most markers in this territory eventually are, 2 feet from where the filed survey said it was, not because anyone had moved it, but because the original surveyor's equipment had a 2-degree error that compounded over distance into something you could feel under your boots. I corrected it. I filed the correction. I rode north toward Rayado and the next disputed boundary. At the top of the first ridge, I stopped and looked back. Red Bluff Basin from above has the quality of all basins viewed from height. Self-contained, complete, the water running the west edge, and the red rock formation catching the afternoon light in colors that change as the sun moves, orange to rust to a deep, complicated brown that is not quite any of those things. You could see the ranch structures from up there, the southeast quarters and the main house and the frame of the second room going up on the east side. Small from this distance. The bay mare was in the east pasture. 2 people were at the north fence, too far away to identify, working the line. I held my ledger under my arm and looked for a while. Then I opened it and wrote the last margin note for Red Bluff Basin, February 6, 1888. The basin is building. The second room is framed. The mare is in the east pasture. From this distance you can't see which direction the doors open.